I think the customer obsession is what drives business value. The big thing that people miss, it also supports your cost management as well, because when you truly understand what customers value, you stop spending money on the stuff that they don't.
Welcome to Deliver, the last mile performance podcast where we explore what it takes to operate, scale, and differentiate in today's market. I'm your host, Bloch, and I'm the CEO at Bringg.
And I'm Raquel Zanoni. Together, Guy and I chat with some of today's most knowledgeable retail and logistics leaders to discuss the last mile, specifically how it's evolving and what success looks like.
Today's guest is Chris Conway, Senior Vice President and General Manager for Enterprise at Bringg. Chris spent over 2 decades building delivery operations inside UK grocers. Most notably, he founded Co-op's online food business and scaled it to reach 86% of the UK population. Today, he sits on the other side of the table at Bringg, helping retailers and logistic providers across EMEA and North America build and scale their own delivery operations. This episode is for any retailer or logistic provider who has ever stood up at delivery operations and underestimated what it really takes. Chris has built it, scaled it, and watched what breaks. Raquel, what stood out most to you from the conversation?
I think for me, it's when Chris specifically talked about the discipline of running a postmortem on every single delivery failure. And I think it makes sense, right? He said, rather than assigning blame, you need to identify the root cause and prevent it from happening again. And his point was really that treating symptoms is expensive and endless, and that fixing root causes of failures is the only real path to improvement. It's kind of this reminder that the failure you see at the doorstep is almost never where the failure actually started. What about you, Guy?
Well, for me, it was Chris' great point that KPIs have 2 jobs at once. They tell you where the business is working today and also where to focus next. He said that the most meaningful shift Co-op made was moving from operational metrics like peak time and cost per drop to customer metrics. By the end, every internal meeting started with one question. What customers did we lose and why? Customer churn drove the conversation in the boardroom, not sales or cost.
This was a really great conversation. So let's not make the people wait. We'll dive in, and don't forget to subscribe to get future episodes just like this one.
Hello, Chris. Such a pleasure to host you and Deliver, the Last Mile Performance Podcast. And I must say that your story is one of the more interesting arcs in Last Mile. Why? Because you spent over 2 decades inside UK grocery with Morrison and Asda Walmart, and most recently at Co-op, where you build delivery operations from scratch. And you eventually took Co-op's online food business to 86% of UK population. And here you are, sitting on the other side of the table at Bringg, helping retailers and logistic providers across EMEA and North America do exactly what you did in Co-ops and other grocers, how to build out and scale their own last mile operations. So here is my opening questions to you. Most retailers eventually offer delivery because they have to. And if that's the case, how did delivery become a C-suite strategic priority rather than simply a supply chain afterthought? And once you answer that, also tell us what processes or conversations powered that shift.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Really good opening question and quite a broad subject, actually. So first of all, thank you for inviting me today. I think the question was around how did delivery become a C-suite strategic priority, right? And I think it really became a C-suite priority when it became the customer's priority. So obviously the changing dynamics of the market, and it depends which vertical you're in, but eventually customers have been trained, consumers have been trained. If you look at the likes of Amazon that have shocked the market and really delivered exceptional customer service and really changed the customer expectation from any retailer. And therefore, delivery becomes not an addition to your process, not an addition to your business, but an integral part of how you deliver your brand to consumers. And I think as soon as the C-suite realized that consumers wanted that, they were forced to make it a strategic priority. In my experience, in the few retailers that I worked in, it's happened at different paces in different ways. And I think most recently at Co-op, we were last movers really in the grocery market in the UK. The UK was quite a mature grocery e-commerce market. So actually coming in on the back of it, a lot of the consumer demand was almost proven. Therefore, the C-suite knew it was a strategic priority. They just didn't know how to do it. Whereas I think the early adopters, so I remember in Asda and in Walmart, probably 2005, 2006, it was still in its immaturity. And I think then the C-suite needed some convincing. The capital investment was quite high. The last mile costs were quite high. The operational costs were quite high. And that was a very different proposition. And I think what persuaded the market was, especially in the UK, we had one outstanding retailer who was really doing a shining light, and that was Tesco. They were investing a lot of money and being quite rapid and aggressive in their growth. They did that early on. And actually, they still got nearly 40% of the UK market in grocery online. And that's because they did it before anybody else, and they were strategically investing capital in that footprint. The rest of us caught up and got a foothold in the market. And those of us that were early on, I think Asda were second movers in the market, and they quickly got number 2 market share, way ahead of their physical market share quite quickly. So I think there are different answers to your question, but I think now it's a fundamental part of every retailer's strategy. It's very rare that I meet retailers that aren't talking about it or don't realize that delivery is an integral part of what they do and who they are. Sorry, Raquel, go.
No, you go.
No, I was going to say the second part of the question was around what processes or conversations powered that shift. I've already talked about consumers, but ultimately I would say it's market share. So as soon as the C-suite started seeing market share shift, and then people changing the way they shop from their physical outlets into other retailers through delivery methods, all of a sudden it then becomes economics, and it then becomes a balance sheet problem and a P&L problem. And as soon as that happened, you didn't need to force anybody. It was forced upon you. And I think that was a dynamic shift that happened.
I definitely have to agree with you, Chris, on sort of the reasons that we see retailers prioritizing final mile. But there's something you mentioned in there when you said you all were trying to stand it up, and it became more of a question of how. And I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. I come from an implementation background, so I know, and I've seen when retailers are thinking of standing up maybe a new offering, a same day or a express, or even just a last mile operation in general, there seems to be like a disconnect between where they want to be and what it's actually going to take. I've seen crazy timelines, right? Of it's going to be a 6-month project. We're just going to stand this up really easily. But I almost feel like there's a lot of knowledge missing, even though last mile seems to be like on the table for so many of these retailers. So I was actually hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your experience building operations from scratch, and maybe share some of your insights and experience from the co-op specifically in terms of investment, timeline, organizing people around that project. I mean, what did that look like?
Yeah, again, another great question. I think I joined Co-op in 2018, and the business had no online presence whatsoever. The competitors were pulling ahead, and there was a real sense that Co-op was being left behind when I got there. So that was almost a catalyst for us to do something. But also there was something else. I think there was kind of some internal scar tissue, I guess you call it, from previously they'd attempted to go launch an online service. They launched a very small trial in a couple of stores, and it hadn't worked and cost them quite a bit of money. So when I started talking about doing it again with the board, obviously some of them were understandably cautious and reticent about investment. So I think the first thing I did really when I went in, I spent the first 3 to 6 months actually just listening. I talked to the colleagues, some of them who'd been involved in the previous attempt. I talked to our customers, most importantly. I also talked to our suppliers and some of the consultants that had been in previously. And I think what became quite clear quite quickly actually was there was a genuine untapped opportunity, not just in online grocery, but specifically in quick commerce. So I think the reason the co-op was actually really well placed was because it was hiding in plain sight almost. We've got over 2,500 stores geographically spread, sitting across the UK, exactly where our customers live, on everybody's doorstep. And that was a significant asset that we didn't really know how to leverage and use. So also at the time, Co-op didn't have a large appetite for heavy capital investment. Around that time, there had been significant economic issues in the UK market. Therefore, capital investment was quite scarce. So therefore, it was really important that when I brought it to the table, it was brought in a different way than I'd done in previous businesses, which was quite capital heavy, I guess. So I designed the business case to be largely variable. It was based on variable cost, and it was scale with order volume rather than requiring a large upfront commitment. I drew on my experience probably at other retailers really to build assumptions across a kind of broad P&L, basket size, margin, picking costs, last mile costs. There were broad assumptions, but credible ones really, I would say. And that variable structure was really what got us through the door and saying, actually, we'll firm these assumptions up as we go along. In terms of how we actually launched, I think in reality, we had to be quite resourceful. We had very few people. For picking, we used existing store colleagues that were already in the business. We built on variable hours within the stores rather than adding in extra fixed headcount at that stage. For the delivery, we used a mixture of third-party providers and our own fleet. Interesting, we had the own fleet story is quite unique to Co-op actually, because we'd actually been running a home delivery service for about 15 years. And that was a kind of a legacy home delivery business where, our older customers who didn't have transport would come in and do a large shop within a Co-op store. They would buy the shopping at the register or the till, and they would put it to one side. And then at some point later in the day, our driver would drop it off at their house. It was kind of a community service that we did. It was quite a significant business 15, 20 years before I arrived at Co-op. And over time, it had reduced and reduced as those customers had started to order online with other retailers because it was easier to order from the home. So therefore, we had an aging fleet, if you like, an unloved fleet of vehicles that were just kind of sitting there and not really utilised. So we were able to utilise some of that fleet to almost kind of prove the concept. And again, it was assets the business already had, so it was kind of minimal investment from that perspective. We built the platform, the order management system, the last mile capability, and we did all that with trusted partners. We started the build in October 2018, and we were live to customers by March 2019, so kind of less than 6 months. Our initial footprint was 30 stores across London and Manchester initially. But I think there's probably one part that's actually the most important, I would say. Going live wasn't the finish line. It was the starting line. It was kind of the beginning of the proof of concept. What we did then is we closely tracked results against every assumption in the business case. That kind of broad assumption P&L that I talked about before, we started to go down that. As those numbers firmed up, we started to hit our internal stage gates almost, and the business gained a bit of confidence every week that went by, and the basket size that we thought would be there was there. The picking cost that we estimated was about right. The frequency of order was about right. It was there or thereabouts. So as these numbers kind of firmed up and we were able to ink them in, it built that confidence one bit at a time internally. And, we ended 2019 delivering from over 200 stores. And by the end of 2020, we were operating from over 1,000. So it was quite a relatively slow build up from 30 to 200 in those first kind of 7, 8, 9 months. And then a rapid expansion to over 1,000 quite quickly after that. And that was because we we earned the right to do that. And, we earned the right on the C-suite. Actually, the numbers that we put down on paper for a very small initial investment were proven. So when people normally ask me that question, what it actually takes to build up something like this, I think the honest answer is it isn't a single big bet. It's about structuring things so the organization has to say yeah to the next stage, not the whole journey. And sometimes if you ask for the world, it's quite difficult. But if you ask for, I want to move us from here to stage 1 and from stage 1 to stage 2, it's much easier. You start lean, you prove the model, then you scale with confidence. And that's really what worked for us, I think.
I have a follow-up there actually that got me thinking, because you mentioned the business case, and I want to pick on that a little bit, because I think oftentimes we see this a lot. Retailers will come to us with just a giant list of functional requirements of, hey, here's everything that we want to do. And I think that's the way a lot of operations will kind of attack a problem like this. But it sounds like you really started with the business case and let that inform the strategy around what to deploy and when to deploy it and how scrappy to be in the beginning. So can you talk through that decision a little bit? I think that's really, really key here.
Yeah. And I think it has to start with a business case, because if it's something that you want a large organization to believe in and invest in, and you want champions within that internal organization, you have to talk in that way. But in truth, it started with the customer. And I think what we realized quite early on, and I kind of referred to it there probably without expanding on it in great detail, was this was quite a different concept. It was about utilizing those local stores, almost kind of those miniature distribution centers in the heart of people's communities. And the existing grocery market in the UK, the online grocery market, was predominantly big box, big basket scheduled orders. They weren't delivering from local store to local door in a quick fashion. So because of that, some of the business cases were a bit broader than before, because we knew that people wouldn't spend as much as a planned shop. And actually, we thought we weren't sure what customer missions they were. We had some proof points though. I think we looked at the way that people ordered takeaways, for example. We looked at the way that people came in our stores and shopped. And, I worked for big box retailers, and I knew the in-store basket size was X. At the time, it was £24-25. And then I came to a convenience retailer where the in-store basket was £10. So, if you look at the ratios then, you say, actually, if you apply that, it's quite a considered way to do a builder's business case. So let's just use that and say, actually, if people do spend 30, 40, 50, 45% of what they spend in a big online shop, that would be a great start. And, when I managed the Asda business, people were spending £80 on an online shop. So, we assumed from a co-op perspective, they'd spend 30. And I think that was a fair assumption. So we backed it up with solid kind of experience, if you like. But then we said, actually, what do the customers want to do? And the customers want to do in our physical stores. They want to be in and out. They want to do it as quick as possible. So we started there and said, actually, how do we design our proposition to be in and out? And then the business case kind of flows off that. So we gave the impression internally that we started with the business case, but the reality was when we got in a room and started thinking about this proposition, it started with the customer, I would say.
You're sharing so much invaluable information here for retailers that listening to the episode. So allow me just to pull on that thread just a bit more and ask you, what other or extra consideration did you have to make when you set up the same day and quick commerce capabilities?
Yeah. And you're right, Guy. It was different because we couldn't cookie cutter an operation or a business case from anywhere else because it wasn't being done well anywhere else. This was pre-COVID, before anyone really thought about quick commerce. So I think one of the biggest challenges we had is that we were operating in that largely uncharted territory. So same day grocery, it wasn't prevalent, as I've just said. Every competitor was focused on large basket, scheduled deliveries, the traditional model. So when I was trying to win hearts and minds internally, I didn't really have a wealth of comparable data to point to. So you're asking people to kind of back something that isn't easily benchmarked, probably. It does require a different kind of conversation. It's about conviction, if I'm honest, passion, logic, the strength of the underlying insight rather than just the numbers. From a technology perspective, that uncertainty is precisely probably why we made the decision to build new systems and new partnerships rather than adapt existing ones. And it would have been easy to build it on the legacy systems that we already had in the co-op, but the legacy systems simply weren't designed for immediacy. So it made the decision easier almost. The legacy system was built for scheduled large basket fulfillment that everybody else was doing. So we knew from day one that immediate delivery was a non-negotiable requirement almost. And because we started with the customer, as I just said, Raquel, their mindset, their missions, and we built the technology to suit that rather than the other way around. Operationally, again, quick commerce introduced a different kind of complexity. With scheduled delivery, you have predictability almost. You have, with same day, you're dealing with demand that's harder to forecast. It means you've got to take some bets sometimes with colleague scheduling. We mitigated as much fixed cost as we could by spreading capacity across third-party couriers alongside our own fleet, as I mentioned. And we kept the variable cost model we'd established from the start. That was really, really important. It was key, actually. But honestly, what would I say? The most underestimated challenges were probably the customer experience, and specifically, retraining customer behavior almost. For years, people have been taught to use grocery websites in a particular way. You browse, you spend time, you're adding 50 plus items, you're planning your week, you're planning your menus. And I spent years trying to keep people on the site for as long as possible and try to add that extra item. It was really, really incredibly important and still is. That mental model existed really, and quick commerce is fundamentally different. Immediacy is about speed and simplicity. So we deliberately designed our UX to feel less like a traditional grocery shop and more like ordering pizza. As I said before, fewer items, faster decisions. The checkout was frictionless, quite a conscious and quite deliberate departure really from what customers were used to in traditional grocery. I think that's, thinking back now, and it feels a long time ago now, although it was only 2018, but it probably feels like a bit of a leap. That was our leapfrog moment, really, and it was very, very rare for the co-op. The co-op is a 180-odd-year-old organisation, and actually, a little-known fact is that in the 1970s, it was a number one grocer in the UK, and now it's number 5 or 6, depending on which read you use. So, it's a complicated group and organisation. It's a cooperative which makes different decisions, makes doing things harder. And I think to have a leapfrog moment in an organisation such as that was quite unusual and quite rewarding. Actually, I think when you're promising someone they're ordering under an hour, the stakes around fulfillment are also much higher than any scheduled delivery. That it's if something goes wrong with a next day delivery, it's inconvenient. If something goes wrong with a delivery you're expecting in 30 minutes, it's a much bigger deal. So getting the order right, keeping the customer informed became even more critical, I would say. When we launched in 2019, no other grocery retailer was sharing live order tracking, for example. Not one, but for us, it was a requirement from day one. It was a non-negotiable. We wanted customers to be able to track their order in real time, the same way you track an Uber or Deliveroo, DoorDash order. That was our leapfrog moment. We didn't just match what the market was doing. We set a new standard, and I think the customer response told us everything we needed to know about how much it mattered.
So March 2019, you have a complex operations that literally drives impact to your EBITDA. Well, if you do it right, customer lifetime value grows, you get more conversion on the checkout, everyone is happy. You do it wrong, customers just leave you and never come back. What were your magic KPIs to measure the success of your delivery operations? And even more importantly, did those measurement standards change over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it was the first question that everybody asked: what are the KPIs? What are we going to track? And I think when you're building something new, your KPIs probably have to do more than one job. They have to do 2 jobs at once. Probably they need to track where the business is working, and they need to tell you where to focus next, I would say. So for us, that the measurement framework was never static. It grew and it matured as the business did, to be fair. We started with the fundamentals: sales, basket size, margin, picking cost per drop, the kind of traditional levers you find in any retail P&L. But alongside those, we kept a very close eye on time on site, because we made a conscious decision to design for the speed and simplicity that I mentioned before. We need to know whether we were actually delivering that or not. If customers were spending too long on the platform, that was a signal that actually something wasn't working. It was actually easy to measure, but really, really important, I would say. On the last mile side, our headline metric from the start was the total time from when a customer did their order to when it hit the doorstep. That was the most important thing. And when we first launched, we felt we were being quite ambitious, and we targeted under 90 minutes initially. But we didn't just measure the total. We then broke it down into component parts. What was the pick time? What was the wait time? What was the delivery time? And that granularity actually really mattered, because it told you exactly where in the journey you had the problem. And then laid underneath that were all the quality metrics, the nil pricks, the substituted items, the refunds, the returns, the fraud. I've probably missed a couple, but because in quick commerce, if the customer doesn't get what they order, the whole proposition falls apart. I think also as we scaled, the picture got a lot more interesting. Some of our early assumptions, as I said before, turned out to be true, but some of them turned out to be quite conservative, actually. Basket size, for example, came in higher than we'd modeled, which is great. That's a good news for any retailer. It was a really positive surprise, actually, and give us a bit more headroom. Scaling also exposed the KPIs that weren't hitting target. Cost per drop actually was the main one, which is quite timely considering the conversation we're having. Now, early on, it was really high, as you'd imagine. We had to invest in hours, in fleet. We had to make sure we had the capacity to fulfill those orders, because the last thing you'd want it to do for someone to order and you not be able to get it to them. So you couldn't let that happen in the early days. But as we grew, we learned quickly. We got much better at scheduling our own fleet efficiently, and we used third parties, most importantly, to absorb those peaks and troughs in demand. You can kind of plan immediacy, even within kind of 50-60%. You kind of know that that's going to come. They're going to order at breakfast time, they're going to order at lunch, they're going to order at dinner time, and then there'll be a rush before you close. But actually, those peaks and troughs in between, it's really, really hard to model those. So kind of using third-party carriers to do that actually supported our kind of fixed cost base and supported the variable model that I talked about earlier on, I think. And I think also, as confidence in the operation grew, we challenged ourselves on delivery time. So we moved the target from 90 minutes down to under 60. That was a meaningful shift at the time, and it became possible because we understood the operation well enough to know where to find the time. Was it in the picking time? Was it in the order time? Was it in the collection time? And that helped us. Shaving little bits here, little bits here, helped us to get that in. And the evolution I'm probably most proud of was the shift towards customer metrics. So over time, we moved beyond the operational KPIs and started looking much more closely at customer behavior. When they order, what they order, how frequently do they order. We segmented the customers into groups, loyal customers, champion customers, occasional customers, and we tracked churn closely, who we're losing and why. And I think that last piece became central to how we ran the business. We started every single meeting with, what are the customers lost? Why did we lose them? Why have they churned? It wasn't sales first. It wasn't cost first. It was lost customers first. Because if you understood why someone stopped ordering, you understood exactly what you needed to fix. Kept us honest, kept us focused on what actually mattered. And in the early days, I think that's what really supported the scale.
I like that you focused on the failure a little bit. We love a good success story, but we learn more from our failures. And so with that, I want to pivot the topic a little bit here and talk about where things show up when there is a broken piece of the puzzle. And generally it's because it's final mile, right? Or last mile, we're talking about the very end of this supply chain. And so it's possible that things went wrong much earlier, but we just don't know about it until it's at the doorstep. Maybe you can walk us through an example from your time at Co-op or Asda where something broke at the doorstep, and then how did you specifically trace it back through the operation to figure out where that was happening? And where do you find the root cause usually sits? Maybe there's some themes that you can pull out and share with us.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. So this is one of the easiest questions because there are a lot of examples here, unfortunately. And I think when I first started leading large e-commerce businesses, 20 years ago now, a mentor of mine at the time said to me, "You need to get really good at taking feedback and really good at listening to customers because you're right at the shelf edge. You're right at the customer's door here, and they're going to give you feedback, and you're going to learn a lot." So it's a really good question. I think one of the fundamental challenges, especially with quick commerce grocery, is that every order isn't planned in advance. You don't always have the forward visibility of what's been picked, what hasn't, and that creates a vulnerability. Let's be honest, and it showed up in one of the most serious examples. Probably the first year I was at Co-op's probably the best example, and because we were scaling the business, it was incredibly important that we got every single customer right. So a customer placed an order relatively late at night in the evening, and when you looked at the basket, it was clearly a recipe, a family meal. The main course in that meal was beef mince. It was clearly a large family meal, and when the colleague in store went to pick the order, the beef mince wasn't available. So they made a judgment call, substituted it for pork mince, something they'd done before with other customers without an issue, and it was a pretty, on the face of it, seemed a pretty good substitution. When the driver delivered the order, the customer was extremely upset. Her religious beliefs meant she couldn't eat pork. It was quite an insult that we'd taken pork instead of beef mince. It was quite serious. It was late in the evening. This is one of the things about quick commerce. You can't quickly go out and buy an alternative. And obviously she planned everything around this delivery that was due in the next kind of 60 minutes or so. So, what should have been a family meal was now like a crisis almost. And, the driver called the store. To their credit, the store manager sourced beef mince from a nearby store and was able to get it delivered to the customer quite quickly. And if I'm honest, we were lucky that we had a really switched on store manager. And I think in the early days in that first year, because we scaled to, I think, about 200 at max, I almost had a personal relationship with every store manager and even a lot of the colleagues that were actually picking the orders. So they were really, really tied into they were really bought into making this a success. So they were able to get the customer what they wanted. But, the customer was satisfied in the end, but they weren't delighted. Let's face it, and we monitored that specific customer afterwards because they were a regular customer prior to that, and their frequency dropped. They did shop again a little bit, but, clearly they lost a bit of faith in us, and they potentially started coming in store instead of making sure they got the end. That's not what we wanted to do. So it was a real lesson in the really early days. And when we traced it back, actually, the root cause wasn't the colleague's decision in the moment, because that wasn't a bad decision. It was more about the systems that we put in place. We called it the substitution tree, but we had an engine that suggested alternative products when something wasn't available. And we hadn't really built in any awareness of religious dietary requirements, or even allergies, actually, which was, once we discovered this one, we were like, well, what about allergies? And what about this? And what about that? And all of a sudden, all this whole new concept of stuff that we hadn't necessarily considered at the start. We were like, we got this really, really top of the range algorithm that if you haven't got beef mince, you get pork mince. If you haven't got pork mince, you get turkey mince. And all of a sudden, everything works swimmingly well for a bit, and you think you cracked it. And actually you haven't. So, finding that out early on, we didn't crack it straight away, by the way, but we were able to build in requirements into our substitution tree that meant over the course of the next kind of 9 to 12 months, as we optimize that decision tree and we learned about it, we were able to start to influence the substitutions and check if someone has allergies. And then we implemented something at the front end that said, tell us if you've got allergies, or tell us if you don't like a particular product. And that really helped as well. But that all came later. The initial thing was actually, how can we make that system work better? So we cut out 99% of these cases. And, the front door failure was a distressed customer at 9 p.m. But the cause was actually a gap in the substitution album. That's how far back it usually sits. It isn't at the customer doorstep. It's somewhere back in the store or back in your systems. So finding that root cause is actually the most important thing.
And for our US listeners, beef mince is ground beef. I feel like I should put that out there just in case y'all are scratching your heads.
Yeah.
That's a great story. I wanted to maybe dig a little bit more though, because you're I like this. I like the substitution piece. That's really interesting for grocery. I want to focus a bit more on like the delivery piece of this. And I think something that comes up a lot, especially with grocery, is how do we use our own fleet and our 3PLs or our DSPs together? Like, how do we make the right choice there? And I'm curious if you have any, maybe there's nothing here, but like, is there any insight you have into that decision-making process, when you would use them, when you wouldn't use them, and how that showed up in the customer experience?
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you from my own experience. I know it varies depending on locality and geography and different providers. But I think our going in position was that our own fleet would be the best customer experience because they'd have the uniforms, they'd have the branded fleet, they'd probably have the best doorstep experience and would get the best ratings. And actually, that wasn't true. It didn't come through in the customer satisfaction scores in terms of the star ratings and the on-time metrics, because what I mentioned before is actually the customer's been trained and they've been ordering from Amazon for 20, 30 years now, and they're used to different drivers turning up on the doorstep and dropping things, hopefully in the door, occasionally elsewhere. But, I think that they're almost trained that you don't have to have a specific delivery driver. So that was quite a eureka moment for us. It was kind of, oh, right, that's so we don't have to have our own delivery drivers. We can have third parties. So once we realized that I think I knew that anyway, but I think internally across the C-suite, that was the data that we presented on that was quite important. So actually, it's okay for us sometimes to use this or sometimes to use this. It doesn't matter. We can interchange. And then it comes down to cost and business case. And actually, rather than a customer decision, it's a business decision. And then you start to structure that delivery mechanism to be a business benefit rather than a customer benefit, because the customer still benefits. So I think what we did is I kind of referred to it earlier on, but where we had fleet and we wanted to retain fleet where we had the right volume of orders, we were able to schedule in a kind of base fleet. So we knew that actually, even if we hit our base order number, that would keep that fleet busy and keep it full and keep it optimized. Therefore, that fixed cost and the kind of hourly rate that we were paying the drivers was worthwhile and paid for itself. And that was great. And we retained colleagues because of it, which was important in the co-op. So that worked. And then we managed the peaks and troughs with third parties. And then I think as volumes grew and we got better rates from third parties, that's where we saw an increased business benefit of turning actual standard on-fleet volume over to third parties. And we started to do that in localities where it made sense. So in the cities where there was large coverage of third parties, when city centre London, Manchester, Birmingham, those big cities in the UK where the proliferation of carriers was huge, the speed in which you could get a carriage to the door was fast, really, really fast, and they were able to deliver it really fast, and they were able to take multiple orders and different orders, and then we saw a real cost benefit to the business. So we started to make decisions that moved volume to third parties, and then we were able to actually reduce our fleet and reduce our investment in fleet. At the same time as that, we also had a zero emission commitment internally for our own fleet. So although we shrunk our fleet, we were able to renew the fleet at a lower cost and have really brand new vehicles and zero emission vehicles. And we were able to deploy that fleet into areas where we didn't necessarily have third party carriers. So in the UK, in Scotland, we've got islands, for example, which are quite hard to get to. And that although they do have some third parties there, they're often expensive and not the traditional carriers. So there we would use own fleet. And certain rural areas, when it got late at night, we'd use own fleet, or early in the morning, we'd use own fleet where we couldn't cover it. But it's a complicated answer to your question, Raquel. I know it's quite a straightforward thing, but really, I think it really depends on your individual circumstances. I'd encourage anyone out there to not be worried about third-party carriers. I think it's a positive customer experience in the main, and the carriers that I've worked with have been determined and really, really focused on the customer. They're very customer-led businesses, actually, I've always found. So I wouldn't worry about the customer end of it. which therefore makes the decisions around the business benefit. And you start to then trial, and there's a bit of a trial and error and a bit of kind of different geographies where different carriers work better. And I think once you work that out, I think you've got a really great delivery service on your hands.
No, I think that's really good. I feel like reminding folks that there is no silver bullet or one size fits all solution. It really is so highly dependent on location, geography, customer experience. Like there's just so much.
Endless. And I'm thinking, Chris, as I'm listening, and I know that in retail and especially in grocery, the visible failure is always at the doorstep. Whether it's a mislot, the substitution, the spoiled item, something that goes at the doorstep for customers to be not satisfied. But we know that the cause always sit weeks earlier in the planning or fulfillment. That's usually what drives eventually the failure at the doorstep. I want to ask you, how did you make the case inside the business for fixing the upstream problem when everyone's attention was just at the doorstep?
Yeah, I think in the moment, Guy, the priority is always the customer. So you do whatever it takes to make it right. In the previous example, getting the products you needed that evening was the only thing that really mattered there and then. But I think once the customer's taken care of, the discipline is in what you do next. And that's a really important thing. For me, every significant failure, you have to have an autopsy.
Yeah.
You need to apportion blame, not an individual, but you need to identify root cause. You need to put a plan in place so it doesn't happen again. And that's why we made it a habit to review these incidents systematically, not just log them, but genuinely understand them. The risk in any operation is that once a customer is appeased and the complaint's closed, it's gone off the system, the energy kind of dissipates and nothing changes. But the doorstep failure gets treated as a one-off. But you're not asking what's caused it. You're not asking how far back that cause sits. And you'll be fixing the same problem again next week and the month after and the month after and for months after that. I think the case for going upstream is simple. Treating symptoms is expensive and it's endless. So fixing the causes is actually how you improve.
Okay, last question from me on this topic. Imagine, Chris, if you will, a grocery CEO gives you a single quarter, so 3 months, and a fixed budget to improve. No, you just get one. Fine, we'll give him 2 quarters. You can have 2 quarters, a fixed budget.
You mean 3 months, not currency. No, you mean a few months.
Yes, you have 6 months, a fixed budget, and you get to improve. Really, I'm going to let you pick one KPI that you think is important. You have to improve that KPI. Where would you spend that money, and where would you say not worth it? Don't spend the time or energy here.
Yeah, it's a good question. First thing I'd ask is what metric it is we're trying to move. I think that changes what you do next. Let's say the goal is improving customer satisfaction rather than reducing cost. And it's normally one or the other, right? You normally want to save cost, or you want to improve the customer satisfaction and therefore grow your business. I'd say the first thing I would not do is spend any more money on fleet and drivers, because I think that's the instinctive answer when deliveries are failing. You throw capacity at it. In my experience, in most cases, capacity isn't the issue. What I'd focus on instead is the basics, but I mean relentlessly. Customers want 2 things. They want to get what they order, and when they want to get it when they were told they would, and that's it. Everything else is secondary. So I double down, trust in the systems, the picking system, the order collection process, the routing system. They're the foundations that determine whether the customer gets what they ordered and on time. I'd make sure that every single person in the operation, from the picker in store to the driver at the door, understood and trusted the system rather than try to work around them, because that's a common thing and a common failure. Back to what we talked about before, a lot of the time the root cause is they're not following the system or they're not following the process. And then visibly, customers can tolerate a lot if they know what's happening. keeping them informed throughout the journey, not just at the point of failure. So that's probably one of the highest return investments you can ever make in customer satisfaction. It costs you far less than extra fleet or extra drivers, and the impact on how the customers feel about your brand, it's really, truly significant. I think most drivers won't fix, more drivers won't fix a broken substitution tree. More drivers won't fix a picking error. If you start with what the customer actually experiences, trace it back, fix that, and that's what I'd invest in.
So, Chris, let's shift to customer expectations because, we all see it. They move extremely fast. And we also know that the bar will just keep moving, right? So looking forward, what will retailers who treat delivery as a cost center look like in 2 years compared to the ones who treat it as a brand promise?
Yeah. The way I think about this, it's bigger than delivery itself, really. It's about how you think about your business as a whole. It's about being where the customers are and letting them access your brand in the way that they choose. So we know customers are increasingly choosing online over physical retail. That's a trend for a long time. That shift shows no signs of slowing. So if you're treating delivery as a cost to be minimized rather than a channel to be invested in, you're essentially choosing to be less accessible to your customers over time. And in 2 years, that will show, declining relevance, lost frequency in customers who simply moved to a competitor who made it easier. The retailers who treat delivery as a brand will look different. I think every interaction at the doorstep is a brand moment. The ones who understand that will be building loyalty through the delivery experience, not just fulfilling transactions. I think the practical reality is the sooner you get into delivery, the sooner you start optimizing it. The learning curve is real. Its scale changes everything. Your cost per drop, your routing efficiency, your carrier relationships. You can't shortcut that experience. So the cost center mindset just doesn't hurt your brand. It delays the learning that eventually makes the operation financially sustainable. Working with partners who understand the ecosystem, who can help you to optimize the last mile is also key. So not just for short-term performance, but for the longer-term financial security of your business. And that's someone speaking from an 180-odd-year-old organization that wants to be around in the next 5, 10, and 20 years.
I just have one final question on my end. Chris, I want to tie this back to something you said at the beginning when you were describing Co-op. Sort of in the beginning stages, you all were maybe lagging behind a little bit in terms of delivery. And then you quickly were able to leapfrog your way above others. I'm curious now, we're 7 years out from that. What are the operators who have leapfrogged the competition? What are they doing today? And you can say AI, but if you do, you have to give specific examples.
No. I think I've mentioned it multiple times as we've had this conversation. It's been, I think AI helps, obviously, but you've got to start with the customer. I mean, it sounds really simple, and it is, but most retailers don't do it consistently, in my view. So the best operators are obsessive around what the customers want, what they expect, how the behavior is changing. They monitor it really closely. They act on it quickly, and they let that drive every decision, from the technology they build to the promises they make to the KPIs they track. AI makes all that easier and quicker and simpler, but it doesn't change why you're doing it and what you're asking. I think the customer obsession is what drives business value. And I think the big thing that people miss, it also supports your cost management as well, because when you truly understand what customers value, you stop spending money on the stuff that they don't. And that's what I talked about a lot. This is something that customers care about. So you double down on the stuff they care about and you stop spending on the stuff that doesn't matter. That's not a soft principle. It's operationally and financially disciplined in my view. The retailers that haven't caught up yet, they're still building from the inside out. They're starting with the operations, their constraints, their existing systems, and then they're presenting that result to the customer. The leaders that do it the other way around, they're the ones that are leapfrogging, I think.
Chris, this is fascinating episode and fascinating conversation. We're coming to the end of that. And I have one last question from me. And it's really for all the listeners here on the call. But if you could give one piece of advice on how leaders can improve their organization's last mile performance, what would it be?
Simply put and briefly, I'd say treat it as a strategic pillar. So it's not a support function, it's not a cost line, it's a core part of what makes your business successful. I think done right, last mile delivery can add millions to your bottom line. It builds loyalty, it drives frequency, it differentiates your brand. Done wrong or done half-heartedly, it costs you in refunds, in lost customers, in brand damage, and it takes years to recover from. I think the leaders who win are the ones who make that decision early, commit to it fully, never stop treating it like it's something that deserves their best thinking, their closest attention. If they treat it like that, then they'll do well.
Chris, thank you so much. That was really an amazing episode, and looking forward to seeing you on future episodes. And thank you everyone else that listened. See you soon.
Thank you.